Mummification is a mortuary treatment with the goal of preserving a body. This is an intentional process to preserve as much soft tissue as is possible. There are some naturally occurring mummies that exist because of the depositional context in which they're in, but we're going to focus on the mummies that are part of a regular mortuary treatment. In this video, I'm going to explore three key aspects. First, we're going to talk about the goal of mummification. Then we're going to move in to think about the process of mummification. And finally, we're going to think about how archaeologists identify mummification in the archaeological record. The goal of mummification is fairly straightforward. It's all about preservation. But it's not just about preserving the soft tissue, but also about keeping the body whole and intact. In this way, it's very different than the types of secondary treatments we've spoken about recently, such as secondary inhumation and cremation. Now, the process of mummification means that the individual that died is visible and recognizable long after their death in ways that skeletonized remains are not. This means that there's also a blurring of the distinction between life and death through mummification practices. With mummies, they're almost alive and able to participate in rituals as those individuals, rather than as a kind of nameless ancestor. The process of mummification can be divided into two main categories. The first is the interruption of the body's natural decomposition process. The second are the social practices that are involved in both preserving a body, but also preparing it for burial. In order to mummify a body, people need to act quickly. Once an individual dies, their body starts to decompose. In that process, the natural bacteria that exist within their body start to chew away at the soft tissue. The breaking down of the soft tissue creates an environment in which additional bacteria and microorganisms can flourish. So in order to keep the soft tissue in as preserved of a state as possible, people have to interrupt this process. Now, in order to interrupt the process that is fueling these microbes and bacteria, people have to cut off the fuel supply, and most of that is in the water that is within the body. So this required that people dry out bodies, or otherwise introduce them into an anaerobic environment where microbes and bacteria can't survive. Desiccation is the process of drying out a body. Now, this can be done in multiple different ways. One such way is to perhaps leave the body exposed to a cold, dry wind to potentially remove the moisture from the body. In some particular contexts, we see people using smoke to help that process of drying out a body along. Another way to do this is to introduce minerals, such as salts, to be able to leach the moisture out of a body and to remove the moisture that way, to leave the body in a state where it's not a desirable place for those microbes and bacteria to survive. Now, in addition to desiccation, people can also put the body into an anaerobic environment. Now, there are two main types. The first one of this is a completely iced location, so something where the temperature is so low and so cold that bacteria and other types of organisms, microorganisms, are not going to be able to actively break down the body. And the other are contexts such as bogs, where we have no oxygen in this anaerobic environment, and so you don't have microorganisms that are there to break down the soft tissue. Whether it's through drying out a body or placing it in one of these anaerobic environments, by removing the environments that the organisms like, people can naturally mummify those human remains. Once the initial decomposition process is interrupted, people can then go to work to try to preserve the body and prepare it for burial. Now, in many cases, this involves removing organs from the body. As I mentioned before, the organs are the places where most of that bacteria are living. And by removing them, you're removing the fuel for the body to be broken down with. When people remove organs, sometimes they also will inter them with an individual. You may be familiar with canopic jars, which are the jars that were manufactured to hold the organs and viscera of Egyptian mummies that were then interned with Egyptian the bodies in those contexts. Sometimes the organs were not included into the burial context at all. Trepanation is also another process by which people use to remove some organs. And in this case, trepanation is all about removing the brain from the brain case. When you trepanate a skull, you're drilling a small hole into the skull, which allows you to then remove the brain through that hole. In addition to these initial steps that help preserve soft tissue, people can introduce additional steps such as dressing the body, positioning the body in a particular type of either a sitting position or extended position, or crouched position or a flex position, according to the social norms and rules in that particular cultural context. In addition to the clothing, other adornment items can be placed with the body as well. Now, when we find mummified remains, we're often dealing with contexts that are in good enough preservation context to preserve those organic materials, such as textiles, as well as the bodies themselves. So oftentimes mummified remains are a great resource for us to study not only the body, but also these additional material cultures that are often not preserved in archaeological contexts. So how do archaeologists identify mummified remains in the archaeological record? Well, when flesh is present, it's fairly straightforward. However, we must account for the fact that there are naturally occurring processes that can preserve soft tissue on a body. If the natural environment is very, very dry, or it's waterlogged, those are things that can create the environment where decomposition is interrupted. So how do we distinguish these naturally occurring mummies from the mummified remains that are the intentional result of a mortuary treatment? Well, the first thing we look to is the care taken to the treatment of the body. If there's evidence of organ removal, it's a great sign that this is part of a social practice of treating the body. The other thing we'll look at is the broader social context. Is this a common treatment within a cultural context? If this is just the one time we find a mummified body, we may think that we have to pay attention to the fact that the depositional environment may be explaining why there's a mummy in this particular context and not in others. So once we have soft tissue preserved, archaeologists study mummified remains in great detail. They can offer a unique window into the lived experience of people that we don't often get just from skeletonized remains. Soft tissue can preserve things such as tattooing that often has very important social significance and ritual significance. We can also see things such as the diet and the health of an individual through examining and analyzing their soft tissue. People use CT scans on mummies to get a detailed view of their internal organs if they're still preserved, and also the connection points between the bones. Sometimes when we have natural mummification or the organs are not removed, we can also look at the stomach contents as a hint at the diet of a deceased individual. though we must remember that that's going to tell us the diet in the last several hours before an individual died, not necessarily what they were eating all the time. It may seem counterintuitive, but there is evidence for mummification even when soft tissue isn't preserved. This makes sense if we think about the social practice of mummification. The social practice is intended to try to preserve the soft tissue as much as possible. However, at the end of that process, there are a whole bunch of natural environmental factors that impact whether or not a mummy will continue to keep that soft tissue, or if that soft tissue will be chewed up and eaten away. One example of mummies where there actually is no soft tissue present comes from Clod Holland in Scotland. In this context, the archaeologists have identified what they call a mummy identification kit. It is all built around looking for the archaeological signatures of mummification that would be left on the skeleton itself. The first one of these is the microscopic look at the cross-section of bones. Now, when a skeleton is decomposing, the microbes and bacteria that are eating away at the soft tissue will also go and eat away at the bone. And so in a cross-section of a bone that has been, of an individual that has decomposed, a lot of the cellular structure is blown through by these microorganisms and bacteria. In the case of Clod Holland, the archaeologists identified that there was some evidence of decomposition and bacterial activity on the outsides of the bones, but that was interrupted after what was probably only several days. And so the bacteria that had been chewing away at the bone were interrupted, were stopped, and not able to kind of continue to eat away at it. So this suggests that there was some sort of action taken by the individuals, the living, to stop the decomposition process, just like we've spoken of as one of the main factors of starting the mummification process. Now, in this context, this may have been by placing an individual in an anaerobic environment, such as a bog, to be able to interrupt that bacterial activity. The second line of evidence in this mummy identification kit is that the position of the body is a very, very tightly crouched burial. Now, the archaeologists argue that the very tight crouching of the body, with the knees up by the chest, would be impossible with a fully hydrated body. So they suggested that the body had to have been desiccated in order to get the lower limbs packed up to the chest as tightly as they are when they're found in the ground. So this tightly packed process suggests there is some desiccation associated with mummification once these individuals were being buried. The third signature was the presence of actually multiple different bones from multiple different individuals that were almost Frankenstein together to create a body, but each of which had evidence of flesh still articulated when they were being connected back together. So we can imagine scenarios where there are the mummification process is preserving bodies, but then the natural forces and natural depositional context will change the preservation and potentially lead to the erasure of the presence of mummified remains, even though that was the intention of the people when they were initially making those burials. Mummification was a mortuary treatment that was important in many places beyond ancient Egypt. From Southeast Asia to South America to Europe. Even today, embalming is a process by which the decomposition process is interrupted to keep the individual body whole and intact for longer. Now, this focus on the body and the completeness and the preservation is an important distinction from other types of mortuary treatments that we've been speaking about before. In terms of the body, We have to ask, why is this the goal of preserving the body intact so strong to go through so much pains and effort to keep a body whole? We have to think about the specialized knowledge that's probably involved in mummifying a body, the costs that are involved, whether it's the minerals needed to decompose a body, or the locations that need to be scouted out and taken care of in order to be able to know where to create and identify these anaerobic environments. Once we have a body preserved, then archaeologists can actually use mummified remains to explore theoretical trends that are very, very important in modern social anthropology today. This is the idea of embodiment. Now, embodiment is the social processes by which living experiences become inscribed in our bodies. Now, this can be from everything from the tattooing and other ways of manipulating flesh, but also the bioarchaeological evidence of our activities within our remains as well. So these mummified bodies provide a unique avenue for archaeologists to explore the concepts of the body in the past, but also how it connects to our understanding of what a person is and the wholeness of a body today.